the truth about decision making. There's a big myth that really decisions are intellectual exercises. False. False, 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 false. And I know that's going to kind of blow you away a little bit, but hear me out. High-stakes decisions are complex social, emotional, and political processes, and they're subconscious. There are a lot of social pressures for conformity and human beings' desire, so our desire for belonging. And that affects and distorts our decision-making. And if you don't believe me, then stay tuned, because we'll show you a couple of examples, one in particular that will really show scientifically that this really is the case. And so when we're social animals, our desire to fit in sometimes overrides our logic. So emotions can either motivate us or at times paralyze us when we make important decisions. And I don't know about you, but that certainly is the case for me. A lot of times when I'm making a decision, it just sits in my gut. It keeps me awake. So at night, it can be a very difficult, visceral experience in making decisions, particularly ones that impact my life, for example, or others. Also, political behaviors such as coalition building. So that's like trying to gather the troops, trying to get support for your viewpoint. It's inherent in our personalities. We like to be right. We'll talk more about that as well. We lobby, we bargain. All of those things play an important role in organizational decision making. This constant negotiation that can occur, this constant, as I said, lobbying, trying to gather the folks around, kind of get them on your side. That has a role to play, and that is completely natural. And because it's completely natural, it can actually be a tremendous detriment on the emergency services ground. So whether it be fire ground, ambulance, scene, whatever that looks like. So we have to be very, very aware of that. So let's talk about a couple of broad categories by which we make decisions. One is what we call naturalistic decision making. It's also called recognition prime decision making, RPD. And what it is it's where the mind, it's the subconscious actually, and this is a key point, it's the subconscious part of our brain that takes our current situation and tries to match it to what it has experienced in the past. And it's happening very, very, very quickly, and as I said, it's happening at a subconscious level. This is where firefighters die. This is where firefighters die, is in this process, because we've learned to make decisions so quickly that sometimes the pattern that we're looking at isn't accurate. Maybe there's a piece of information that's missing. In fact, I would argue there always is. And we'll talk about some ways to mitigate some of those mistakes that we can make when we're using recognition prime decision making. The good news is it's minimal time, or you spend minimal time in your option selection, because your subconscious looks at something, it identifies patterns, and then it figures out a best course of action based on prior experience. But one of the challenges, again, is it's prior experience. So maybe the current experience isn't 100% the same. But it's in place for our survival. So an example might be, I've never been hit by a bus before, and I'm mid-40s. I don't plan on getting hit by a bus anytime soon, knock on wood. And what it means is if there's a bus coming my way, I don't have to have had that prior experience to jump out of the way, for example. Recognition prime decision making sees the pattern, a big friggin' bus heading my way. It calculates the speed all subconsciously, and it decides real quick, get the heck out of the way. That's either dive forward, or maybe it's stop, or maybe it's go back the other way, whatever that might look like. All right, so it's in place for a particular reason, and it has served us extremely well. And we don't have to think about it. That's why we call it the naturalistic decision-making part of how we make decisions. The other one is what we call analytical decision-making. And this is where we're a lot more deliberate with regard to each part of the process. We develop contingencies and alternative courses of action, and we weigh the benefits. This is where an emergency operations center or an emergency coordination center really functions in terms of how it makes decisions, and that's the analytical way. So if I go back, usually in an emergency operations center or emergency coordination center, the snap judgments are not needed, and in fact often are ones that they're probably incorrect, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Analytical decision making, this is where, you know, maybe we whiteboard options, maybe we're doing pros and cons, maybe we're doing a Pareto analysis, force field analysis. All sorts of tools and techniques are out there to make decisions based on the analytics. If anyone's seen Moneyball, great movie, great movie. That is an example where the Oakland A's, I believe it was, were trying to make decisions moving from the model of naturalistic to the analytical decision making. And you're welcome for that pop culture reference. Okay? Now, here's a question that I've always asked myself and observed, but I think I have the answer. Have you ever wondered why it's so hard to work with non-emergency services personnel in an ECC or just in general? And I see that friction all the time. Or you see different challenges with regard to working with people that maybe are of different vocations. And I'm going to pick a little bit on engineers. The stereotype of the engineer is a very process-driven analytical decision maker, whereas we have the run-and-gun fire officers oftentimes, or medics or something like that, where your decisions are happening very, very quickly. Well, that is a natural phenomenon. It's a natural friction that will take place. So don't worry, don't get stressed out about it. It is just normal. And here's why. It comes down to decisional space. So here's our time wedge again. Now, on this side right here, our first responder side, this would be kind of the scene, fire scene, for example, or the back of an ambulance or something like that. We are using RPD a lot, recognition prime decision making. We're looking at patterns, and it's quick. Boom, 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 boom. And in fact, a lot of times what we're thinking, we actually don't even know why we thought it, but we are thinking it, and now we're moving forward and trying to affect change in the environment. Okay, so that's over here on one end. Now on the other side, we have the typical ECC, Emergency Operations Center, or maybe Incident Command Post, for example. That is where they are analyzing those multiple factors. They're taking into account risk management a little bit more broadly. On scene, of course, risk management is part of everything we do. But in this context, it's far broader. It's looking even at liability, legally, those sorts of things. And again, I'm not saying that that doesn't happen here, but it is on steroids in the ECC or Emergency Operations Center. There's a lot of stakeholder engagement that occurs in the ECC, for example. So if we're going to make a decision, well, we need to make sure that we've spoken to various stakeholders. On scene, our primary stakeholders are ourselves, our crew, maybe the public that's in jeopardy, and a very, very small group typically. But as we get into the ECC environment, then that stakeholder engagement, the stakeholder numbers can grow. And we have to make sure that we've engaged them properly so that they have some buy-in to our particular course of action. Also, typically they're looking at a longer term impact, but also short, but longer term. So what does recovery look like for a community, for example? What does it look like in terms of economic development, business continuity? Lot longer term impacts. Over here on scene, our impacts are measured in seconds, minutes, maybe a few hours, but at a structure, there's not one fire officer that I've ever come across that said, oh man, we better be careful here before we go into that structure to save that, that person, because I don't know about the insurance implications of this. It's a bit of a cliche, but you kind of get the point. Last but not least, within the Emergency Operations Center environment, typically we are using a lot of different tools as well. And when I say we, I'm putting myself into Emergency Operations Center mode. We're using GIS. We're using modeling, whether it be plume modeling, whether it be flood monitoring. All of those types of things are all being fed into our decision-making process, when here our modeling is based on our past experiences. Maybe it's conversations that we've had with other individuals around the table, or maybe a little bit around the pub, something like that. Or maybe our experience comes from reading after action reviews, which we've talked about in an earlier module around leadership and so on and so forth. So you can see that these two kind of the decisional space, there's wide ranges of that. We've got some folks over here that are really pumping the brakes on moving forward, and sometimes we can suffer analysis paralysis. And over here, sometimes we can jump to the gun a little bit more too quickly and not gather all the information. So neither one is 100% correct. And part of our challenge as leaders and part of our challenge as responders is to recognize that, you know what, both are valuable, but it's all a spectrum. Because I don't want to show up on scene and wait for our GIS analysis to come in when there's a fire going on, or whatever the situation might be, a search and rescue mission where we don't have maps yet, or something like that. We do have to make decisions rather quickly. Now, conversely though, over here, as I said, maybe we're getting an analysis paralysis and we have to make a friggin' decision, okay? And then we can fix it. But a lot of times we get kind of stonewalled in our minds. And one of the things that we tend to struggle with is a concept that we call the resulting concept. This is what this is. It's analyzing decisions and decision-making solely on the outcome or on the result, rather than the information available at the time or the rationale or probabilities. This is a big problem for us, where we look at something that maybe didn't turn out really, really well, and we automatically assume that it was a poor decision-making process that led into that. A really good example, and man, this is going to be controversial, but if anyone's a Super Bowl fan, remember the Seattle Seahawks goal line against the New England Patriots. Russell Wilson, instead of handing the ball off to Marshawn Lynch, one of the best running backs in the league, especially short yardage, drops back, throws the ball, and it gets intercepted. Now, Pete Carroll was absolutely berated for that particular decision. But something I want you to do, maybe a little bit of homework for you, is figure out what the statistics said about running that play versus the running up the gut. And you're going to be a little bit surprised. Poker is another example. Not that I advocate gambling or anything like that, but maybe just around as a fundraiser. We always think about, well, you know, they lost that hand. That was not a very good play, but it's all about statistics. And so let's resist the urge to analyze decisions based solely on the outcome of it. How many times within hockey or any sports where a team loses in overtime and then there's a change of quarterback or there's a change of whatever it might look like? The reality is, if we're making decisions based on our own opinions, they may not be completely accurate rather than data driven, for example. So the resulting concept is exactly where we are analyzing decisions based 100% on the result, when really maybe the decision-making process was 100% and even the decision statistically was the right one, but it still turned out poorly.